Hey everyone, welcome to episode 3 of the MicaSense podcast. This is Drew, your host. I'm here with Stephen Mangum, my co-host. Today we have Benji Meltzer from Aerobotics. Benji, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Drew. It's good to be involved and good to chat to you again.
Aerobotics, you guys have been on the scene for maybe 6 years. I think you started in. Tell me about what Aerobotics is, what the software does, just maybe an introduction to the company itself.
Yeah, so Aerobotics started in 2014 in September, as you mentioned, and we basically set out to help growers with two core propositions. One being early problem detection, so using aerial imagery, helping farmers pick up problems early and diagnose those issues in the field, whether it's pest or disease or other. And the second proposition being that of yield management. So we build tools to help farmers estimate their yield at a point in time and forecast through to harvest what that could look like. We're primarily focused on specialty crops, fruit being the core focus, and do most of our work in the citrus space. We are based out of Cape Town in South Africa, where I'm based, where we build and run our operations teams and are operational in a number of other countries with sort of boots on the ground in the US, Portugal, and Australia. And I guess we can dig into it through the session, but have kind of evolved from initially building a lot of our own hardware on both the drone and sensor space to now being purely an analytics and software provider within the sector.
When people ask us what is it that allows you to break into the ag industry, I always reference companies like Aerobotics, like Hummingbird, companies that are building specific tools around agricultural management. That's really the only way that our multispectral cameras and the data that they produce is going to allow us to penetrate into the ag industry. So we really appreciate companies like Aerobotics who are breaking into the ag industry with remote sensing technology. You have a pretty interesting background. So you really don't have any ag industry background at all. So what inspired you and a few other people, or I guess who started the company? What inspired you guys to get this started?
Yeah, so maybe a bit of my personal background. I mean, you're spot on. I'm far from a farmer. I grew up in the city. I studied engineering, mechatronics as my undergrad degree at the University of Cape Town, which is where I met James Patterson, who's my co-founder of the business and our CEO. James grew up on a citrus farm in the Western Cape in South Africa. So that's sort of where the agri-domain side of things comes from. We each went off after our undergrad, sort of our separate ways. He worked on the farm for a little bit and then went to MIT where he studied aeronautical engineering, specifically interested in autonomous flight planning and sort of algorithm development on that side. And I worked a couple of jobs and studied a master's in basically machine learning and image analytics. And I mean, at that point in time, we both decided to come back to South Africa to build the business. It was quite a good sort of hybrid of our skill sets. His in the aerial engineering and flight side of things, and mine on the sort of data analytics and software engineering side. To pull those together, we believe to build a solution that would help growers with the problems I mentioned before. We were quite naive in a couple places, and very much we're looking at it from an engineering perspective. I mean, 2014 was quite early in the space. I think we were pretty much one of the first kind of around the world to be using this sort of tooling for this specific application. And more than anything, it was quite a fun problem from an engineering point of view to try solve. And I guess with time, things have evolved a bit, and we've built a team around us to help sort of develop the business.
Tell me how that went down. Did James call you up and say, "Hey, let's start a image analytics company for horticulture"? What were those initial back and forths about to get this thing started?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, when we became quite friendly during our undergrad, and pretty early on, we just agreed that we'd start a business together at some point in time. We didn't agree on what that was going to be. We just sort of knew we'd do something. And during our master's degree, so James is in the US, I was in London, and we spent about 4 months sort of researching and pitching different ideas to each other, very much oriented around our like individual interests and skill sets. And I mean, we were looking at things. We actually dug up the decks the other day. There's some interesting stuff in there, from using drones for shark spotting for surfers in Cape Town, to we were looking at precision spraying technology in the agri space. We were looking at, I mean, I was quite keen on using drones to spray windows in big buildings to clean them. And I mean, we eventually, I mean, it's a bit obvious in retrospect, but that came across the monitoring sort of solutions in the agri space. And honestly, the pitch back then was very similar to what we've actually built today. And it's a bit uncanny, like looking at it in retrospect. But the whole premise was the agri industry is and farming is just a super risky business. I mean, you're managing huge sort of acreage. There's potential that things can go wrong at a point in time, and we just identified that typically there's a challenge in making data-driven decisions. And the core sort of reason we believed was that historically that data didn't exist, and even in cases when it did exist, the sort of tooling to make decisions off of that data wasn't available. And it just sort of, we believed, was very well positioned from a problem perspective to be solved with technology, to collect data at scale using aerial imagery in our case, and really building the tooling to help interpret that information. The other sort of factor which is quite interesting that led to us building the business was, I mean, I mentioned James was at MIT. I was at Imperial College. We were surrounded by pretty smart people internationally, and we had a bit of a revelation just that back here in South Africa, like, there's some pretty amazing talent at a very affordable cost. And similarly, in the domain that we're in, we've got access to some of the best growers in the world. So it just seemed like a really good opportunity to come back and sort of build on the cheap, to build a startup from the ground up, almost partnering with some of the top growers around the world to build this with hand in hand. And I mean, compared to somewhere like Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv in Israel or wherever it might be, like, we didn't have to worry about things like competing in a saturated market. It was very much just around building value for our customers. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of the mentality, I guess, in the first couple of years, where we just focused on building products out for growers.
So when you had a minimum viable product built up and you guys decided to go talk to the first grower, I assume maybe the first farm was James's family farm potentially, but what were those initial interactions like? I'm sure you had maybe a 3 or 4 slide pitch, or did you just say, we're going to fly your field and show you what we can do with it? Or how did those initial interactions go with farmers?
Yeah, it's quite funny thinking back. It wasn't actually James's parents, it was their neighbor. We quite strongly didn't want James's parents to be our first customer. I mean, they're our longest standing customer and our favorite customer. They just weren't our first. So, I mean, I remember quite clearly, we very early on rocked up on the farm, and kind of, fortunately, this guy was quite an early adopter and pretty like a visionary in that he could somewhat understand what the capability of the technology could be, which was quite challenging in the space, is just without seeing something tangible, like being able to imagine what's capable. But we pitched the idea to him around using some form of aerial imagery and specifically drones to help sort of analyze his crop. And we kind of said to him, like, if we were to come back with a product, like, what would it need to do to make you spend money? and pay for it. And the one piece, which is pretty much the core feature in the product today, was he wants to see a red tree is a sick tree and a green tree is a good tree. And he doesn't want to sort of look at pixel level information. He doesn't want to try and interpret all these different multispectral indices. He just wants to know which trees have problems. And I mean, that was literally our mandate for the next 3 months, where we went back and built the system primarily for him. We built our own drone, we built our own camera system at the time, and we wrote a very basic piece of software which used Dropbox as our sort of cloud provider and a local Python application to view the data. And the results were literally a count of trees on the farm with green trees are healthy trees and red trees are sick trees, according to our analytics. And yeah, it's kind of the model that we've used to develop the product up until now. It's just been getting guided by these customers. And I mean, I mentioned it earlier, like we're really fortunate in that the guys here in the industry in South Africa are really forward thinking and really tech savvy. They've had to be to kind of build successful businesses in the climate that we're tackling here, both from an environmental perspective and an economic perspective. There's a whole lot of challenges, and the guys have had to be pretty sort of nimble and agile. And sort of most of the core features that we've built have been very much guided by the market.
What's a typical farm look like in South Africa? I mean, size, crops, etc.
Yeah, so looking at citrus farms as our kind of core target market, our sort of sweet spot here is about 150, 200 hectares. I know you guys talk in acres, which is...
It's like 2.2 acres per hectare, I think.
Yeah, so say 220 acres. So relatively small compared to like the US type ranches, and a very different business. So it's often or always sort of owner managed. The grower themselves would live on the farm most of the time, and they're very hands-on. I mean, they can often tell you sort of back of an envelope which trees are struggling. They kind of know, they get their boots on the ground and their hands dirty, and which was part of the reason that we were sort of well suited here. Is it was more kind of owner-run business compared to selling into some big corporate.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I would think that would have simplified the sales process quite a bit. Yeah. Instead of going to some corporate website and maybe scouring LinkedIn and trying to find the right point of contact, you literally can just pull into someone's yard and be like, this is the owner. Very likely this is the owner.
So 100% in terms of like navigating the organizations and finding the right person. One of the challenges that we tackled was just building trust, in that these guys have typically, I mean, it's 3-4 generations of a family that's been owning the farm. They have very sort of standardized traditional ways of doing things, and coming in with a very new technology, there was very much a trust element that needed to be built, and which did sort of lead to some challenges in just accelerating and growing as quickly as possible. Another point, just in terms of our kind of roadmap, which I'm pretty sure you guys would have felt too, is that the industry very much has followed that sort of Gartner hype cycle, in that we got in quite early. You sort of mentioned the word drone and machine learning, and every farmer was signing up, which led to a lot of sort of players coming into the space, underselling or overselling, and under delivering, and a lot of noise. Sure. And the sort of shift in mindset to, I mean, there was a stage where you kind of mentioned the word drone, and the farmer would say, like, drones can't help me. I know all about them. And we've had to sort of survive that normalization, I guess, of expectations and delivery too, which has been an interesting journey.
Yeah, we know exactly what you're talking about. It seemed like, actually, when I joined MicaSense in 2016, the wave had started to subside, and people were starting to feel jaded about it. And it actually seems like they felt jaded for a few years, maybe 16 to 18 to 19, and now actually the interest is starting to grow again, because people are starting to tie the data more closely to management decisions. And I think that's what's getting people interested again, instead of just here's a drone data set.
Yeah,
That's been good to see.
I completely agree. I mean, it's early on, it was the technology itself that was exciting people, and the market's been educated and kind of been through enough of a journey now to understand what actual value propositions they need to look for. And there's just enough time that's now been spent where you can start sort of allocating things like $1 per acre return on investment that you get out of using this technology, and just clarity on the types of decisions that can be made, and just the market's maturing to a space where I guess there's more of an understanding in what the technology can actually help with.
Should we talk more about the product? So I had some more questions about the product.
Formerly called AeroView, right, Benji?
Yeah, it's the web application. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Aerobotics is the company and AeroView is the program. Okay.
The web program. I mean, there's also a mobile application just called AeroView Infield.
Okay. So with AeroView, can you use an RGB camera, or is multispectral required?
Yeah, so we accept both. There's sort of a base level of analytics that we offer of purely RGB imagery, which would basically be a census for your farm, where we do things like count trees, identify some metrics on a tree by tree basis, like the size of the trees, the height, the volume, etc., and look at things like missing trees and replant programs and things like that. But in terms of the early problem detection proposition, which I spoke about at the beginning, we're completely dependent on multispectral data. So there, I mean, that's where we work with MicaSense and obviously use your guys' sensors to help sort of determine these per plant analytics, which would look at those spatiotemporal insights to try to pick up these problems early. But yeah, there's kind of differing analytics, I guess, that we offer with each sensor type.
And so it's pretty simplified for the end user. Like they're not really dealing with any indices or any complexities like that. It's more of just, like you said, red or green, large, small, or
yeah,
do they have the option of getting that more complex data if they're interested?
They do have the option of getting it. So for more technical users, that information's available for the likes of agronomists, consultants, sort of researchers, etc. It's also exposed through an API. So if they use their own GIS or business intelligence tooling, they can make sense of it. But for the typical user, we're very much sort of focused around the decisions that are getting made and that are likely to get made off of this data, and try to kind of optimize for that to happen as easily as possible, which we believe is often achieved by kind of one level abstracted from the indices in terms of kind of the health of a tree, rather than 5 different indices that you need to make sense of. I think, I mean, just on that, there's a dimensionality challenge, which between you've got the spatial dimension in pixels, you've got the temporal dimension every time you're surveying, and if you're going to add the dimensionality of different indices and different layers of information, just making decisions off of that as a user can be quite overwhelming. And our core kind of value that we're trying to build is kind of downsampling that to a point that a human can actually make sense of and make decisions off of.
Is there any plan to expand to other types of crops? We get a lot of questions for doing plant counts on all sorts of agriculture, and I feel like that would be a useful tool for just general agriculture.
So we get asked this quite often, as you can imagine, and it's one thing I think we've become relatively good at is saying no. We quite strongly believe that for us to be able to offer enough value to a grower, we need to get as deep as possible into their value proposition, especially into their specific crop, especially given our proposed value on allowing a grower to make a decision off of this data. To kind of lead to a decision, you need that domain knowledge and that domain expertise. And as a result, we very much want to get as deep into the specific crops that we're focusing on, citrus as a starting point, before kind of going horizontally into other crops. I mentioned estimation tooling. I mean, that's something that just necessarily transfer horizontally into other crops without investing significant capacity in it. So it's very much a kind of, we don't want to be a jack of all trades. We really want to master specific industries. And from a commercial perspective, we then are going vertically kind of up the supply chain within that space. So I speak about the grower quite a lot as a core beneficiary, but we're also working with other companies in the space, like input providers, to financial services companies, to chemical companies, etc., where this data can be leveraged.
As you're expanding into other countries, US, Portugal, Australia, are you seeing a need to tweak the software for different geographical regions, or is it kind of universally applied?
So it's mostly universally applied, and I think that's part of the value of going as deep as we have, in that we've like honed in on problems that are uniform within the specific cultivars and crop types that we focus on. So I mean, in terms of yield management, there's pretty standard kind of considerations that a grower would take. Obviously, there are. I mean, it's one of the big challenges in agriculture is handling the long tails from a data perspective, and building a generalizable solution itself is really, really challenging, which is another reason that we believe in narrowing the sort of problem space is so important. But we've kind of built the ability inherently to for the models and the product to localize to some extent and kind of calibrate to on the ground data. But in general, the sort of trunk of this model that we've built is transferable enough to other markets without needing significant investment on the ground. The more challenging factor has actually been on the distribution side of things, in building the partnerships and the trust and getting into growers, rather than from a technology or data perspective.
What's the split on farmers flying their own land versus service providers filling in the gaps? I think Steven and I get a lot of requests from people like, hey, I want a field flown. Do you have any pilots in the area?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's maybe something that I didn't give much context on earlier, but the business that works is as a grower, there's two options. Either you fly your own, so you get your own drone, your own MicaSense sensor, and you fly your own crop, or we've got a network of service providers which we would sort of allocate to fly on your behalf, and you pay a subscription fee to cover that. We're sitting at about, I think it's 180 of these companies around the world now that are kind of flying on our behalf.
Wow, that's a lot. 180 service providers.
Yeah, I think it's one of our core sort of differentiators in the space is we're able to collect this data super scalably and at a good price. Myself and a few others in our business worked for Uber before this, and I very much sort of copied the business model from there, in that the sort of supply leads demand thinking. So, I mean, in Uber's case, you get drivers on the road, you trust the product is good enough to get riders to start booking because there's enough availability. And in going into a new market, it's one of the first things we'll do is kind of sign up this network of service providers that can cover enough acreage. And yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting. I've been quite surprised at how well we've been able to build this out. And I mean, we often consider other sources of aerial imagery, whether it be satellite data or manned aeroplane, etc., given that we're very much a kind of solution provider. But with the network of drone service providers that we've got, we're actually able to collect the data at almost half the cost of the kind of the closest comparison already as is, which a lot of people find counterintuitive. I mean, you just wouldn't expect to be able to scale to that regard. I mean, just for context, we flew 80% of Florida's citrus industry 3 months with drone, which, I mean, it's, I think, about 100,000 acres worth of crop. And that was all done through third-party service providers. In terms of the split, at the moment, it's probably about 90% external service providers, 10% growers flying their own. And we imagine that sort of leveling out a bit more over time as the technology becomes more available and less complex to operate, and things like the regulation becomes a little bit more sort of open. But up until now, we found that the service provider model has worked quite well.
With that in mind, how often do you have to fly these citrus crops to get the product that you're looking for?
So, I mean, there's those two specific kind of products that I mentioned. Just the one we call tree insights, the other we call yield estimation. So one's on a tree level, one's on a fruit level. The tree product we're flying 2 to 3 times per season or per year, and then for yield we're flying another 3 times. So if a grower has signed up to both products, which is most of the time, and obviously our ideal case, it will be about 6 flights per year.
What was the reason for flying 80% of Florida's citrus? Was that like a government thing, or what was the reason for that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's an interesting sort of space that we're growing into, being the crop insurance industry, particularly in the US. So I spoke briefly about distribution being a big challenge and kind of getting to growers, and we've narrowly targeted financial services and specifically insurance as a route to market for us. And we've developed some pretty good relationships with some of the top agri insurers in the US. And they need to often do like very broad inspections or assessments. And we worked with one of the big groups this year to do that across Florida. And the sort of proposition is that we can then use that as an angle to get to growers and for a lower cost kind of expose this value of the data to them too, given that it's often being collected sort of at someone else's expense.
So are insurance companies needing multispectral data, or was that mostly RGB outputs?
So we used multispectral to some extent. So the insurance companies, and it kind of talks to our thinking on the whole, aren't interested in specific types of aerial data. They're interested in specific analytics on the health or sort of assumed risk of the crop that they're assessing. And for some of those measures, we've built algorithms using multispectral data to help kind of quantify things like risk and performance on a tree by tree level.
I was on your site yesterday looking at some of the customer interviews, some of the testimonials from customers, and they mentioned satellite imagery and drone-based imagery. How have you caused those to complement each other? What are you using either one of those for?
Yeah, so look, I mean, to be completely honest, this is an area that we still need to improve on. But the sort of high-level thinking is the drone data allows us to get really sort of precise spatial information on like a plant-by-plant basis that enables sort of very, very specific decisions to be made with the grove. What you don't get is historical information. Unless you've flown historically, you don't get that sort of trend temporally of what things have looked like. And we've sort of built a hybrid with the two, where we leverage that archive information from satellite imagery. The data that we're using has often got an archive of up to 4 years to help give a kind of point-in-time assessment of how you're doing at quite a low granularity in terms of like the performance of your crop overall compared to previous seasons. It offers, in our case, some pretty kind of high-level decisions to be made around like year-on-year performance on an orchard or block level. Like if there's any major issues that you could pick up at a low resolution, it's quite helpful. But then the drone really comes in to help sort of narrow that down to specific plants, etc. There's other challenges, just given the data that we use on the satellite side is quite low resolution. You're incorporating things like soil and weed cover, etc., in the calculation of some of the analytics, which is where the drones really help to diagnose the problems. But basically, we've pulled the two data sources together. I mean, the thinking is similar to how I spoke about how we think about the indices on the grower side. The farmer shouldn't necessarily care about where the data is coming from or what the data is. They should just care about the decisions that are being made. And we're kind of working on a couple interesting approaches to merge these together and kind of enable the best of both. There's some pretty interesting sort of academic solutions in fusing these sources of data together that we're trying out, which are looking quite promising.
Interesting. Are you planning on? I think there's a company in the U.S. that is, gosh, what are they called? I can't remember, but they're driving
Planet
around.
Labs?
No.
Oh no.
I'm thinking about this company that's mounted LiDAR onto ATVs and they're driving underneath.
Yes. Yeah, I forget the name of them.
AgriPoint.
Yes. Yeah.
So are you planning on taking data sets like that and integrating them, or is that not really something you guys are looking into?
No, so like not at the moment. I mean, just given capacity and I mean, another point which I'll talk to now, we're primarily focused on aerial imagery. A big sort of component for us is we want to be as remote as possible and non-invasive. And I mean, we don't just operationally sort of building out a network of drone pilots is sort of as complex as we're willing to go versus having on the ground equipment and servicing, and just in terms of how we're planning on building a sort of scalable business model, we are quite tied to the aerial side of things.
When it comes to the service providers and capturing data, these third parties capturing data, we've experienced, especially when we're looking for sample data or we're doing a case study with somebody, there are these instances where the service provider goes out to the field, flies it, there was bad cloud cover and the data set was crap. Or any number of things can happen that can inhibit the service provider from flying. So are there things that you guys have done to mitigate that kind of like wasted time and resources and money? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And I mean, you're spot on. This was a huge challenge for us historically. And I mean, sometimes still is. Mm-hmm. One of the internal teams that we've built out, we've called our drone operations team, which are completely focused on kind of building tools and value for the pilots. And one of the things that they do is assess quality and kind of help train the pilots on generating the best quality in flights. So, I mean, post-processing data will give kind of transparency to the pilot in terms of the quality of the flight, kind of what the data looks like, whether it's environmental factors or flight-specific factors that kind of led to some sort of defect. That's all exposed. We also do things like generate leaderboards across the world and have some sort of competitions within the
Oh, cool. That's a good idea. Yeah.
Fun.
So it's kind of a community. There's a couple. I mean, they can talk to each other, like they know who each other are. And
yeah, a lot of them do, specifically in the smaller markets. There are some kind of tools and techniques that we offer to try detect in the field whether something's gone wrong, just because the methods I spoke about now, like the problem is you'll only find out that something's gone wrong after processing the data, which could be a day after you collected it. And yeah, I mean, just that we call it a defect rate in terms of data that's not of good enough quality and needs to be recollected. We've managed to get down to a super low level, just using those different tools.
As you're expanding into different regions of the world, are there areas where you guys are needing additional service providers? In the off chance that somebody's listening as a service provider and they're wanting to get involved.
Yeah, I mean, we're always looking for more service providers, and I mean, as the demand continues to pick up, like it's in everyone's best interest that sort of our supply is as distributed and as strong as possible. I mean, it's really been amazing to sort of learn how many people there are that are kind of looking for opportunities in the space just around the world. we got someone signed up the other day in Cyprus within 2 days. I mean, like I didn't even know where Cyprus was, and it's just been great. But look, in general, we're always looking. I mean, in all of the markets I mentioned, we've got some amazing partners already, and I mean, we're not going to kind of overload territories where we've got enough supply, just to make sure that they can run sustainable, healthy businesses. But in parts of the US, in parts of Australia, like we're definitely looking.
What about China? I know China's a massive apple producer, and they've got a lot of apple orchards. Are you guys looking into that?
So that's an interesting question. So I actually went out to China 2 years ago with James, my partner, which was pretty eye-opening. To be honest, pretty scary just in terms of the scale of it all. We've decided not to focus there, just given the barriers to getting in from a language, a cultural, or technology perspective. It's just pretty far from home. I mean, it's funny. Like I talk about South Africa having some of the sort of top growers around. I mean, you go to a citrus farm in America, chances are there'll be a South African farmer there working on the farm. Similar in Australia, similar in Portugal. You go to China, there's no South Africans. So it's just been quite a difficult, or it seemed to be a very difficult market for us to break into.
I didn't realize that South Africans were so well known for citrus production and horticulture.
Yeah, look, and it's been I speak about trust being like one of the challenges to growing. It's been a big benefit for us. It's just by nature coming from here. We were nervous it would be a sort of to the detriment of the company. I mean, you land in the US, we've kind of South Africa is pretty much as far away as it gets, but in the agri industry, it's a bit closer than that. Drew, you've been promising us a visit to South Africa for some time. Are you ever planning on getting out there?
I would love to. Can I? I've heard that the biggest expense is just getting to South Africa, and then once you're there, it's pretty reasonable. Maybe I should bring my family. How do you think a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old would fare on a flight across the Atlantic?
No, you need to knock them out somehow.
So we'll wrap up here. Again, Benji, thanks for joining us today on the call. I wanted to ask you a few non-agriculture related questions. So you may have no comments on this at all, but the funny thing, I think there's a funny thing about South Africa is that there are countries within South Africa, like that are locked around South Africa, and I've always been kind of fascinated by those. One of them is Lesotho, and one of them used to be Swaziland, and I'm trying to get used to this new name of Eswatini. Curious to hear your thoughts on those two countries.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I haven't been to either of them myself. It's funny, they're both, like, people outside of South Africa find it so fascinating that this is the case, but within South Africa, it's sort of like you drive through Lesotho on the way to Joburg. It's not from Cape Town to Johannesburg. I mean, I don't have many comments. In Eswatini, it's quite interesting, and Lesotho actually. There's a big growing cannabis sort of industry, so we get approached quite often around requests or opportunities in the space. I mean, if you have any providers that offer services in either in that space, it's potentially quite an interesting market to look at. Lesotho is interesting in that I think it's the only place you can ski in South Africa. It's got some of the highest mountains, but yeah, honestly, other than that, I can't really comment much.
We did sell one camera to Eswatini. It was Swaziland when we sold it, but one Red Edge went to that country, which I thought was crazy. I'll have to look up, and I think it was a service provider, so maybe I should link them up with you guys.
Yeah, that would be cool. There's also a lot of sugarcane out there, which might have been the application.
So are you a SciFi fan?
I am, yeah.
It's one of two questions. What's your favorite sci-fi book or movie first, and then I'll ask the next one.
Favorite book is probably, I mean, the entire Foundation series by Isaac Asimov
Somebody just recommended that to me. I'm gonna read that next. I just
Oh.
finished one book. I'm gonna start that one.
No, it's incredible. I mean, just if you take the context into account of when you wrote it, also, like, it's so accurate. So that, and I really enjoyed Red Mars too. I don't know if you've read it or
Haven't heard of
it.
that one. No.
Actually planning on starting Dune pretty soon.
I just finished Dune 1 and 2.
How was it?
Dune 1 was incredible. Dune 2 was a lot of dialogue. But there's a movie. Did you see the movies coming out in December?
Yeah, that's why I want to read it just before.
Yeah. Highly recommend Dune. It was pretty intense. It was awesome. I'm really looking forward to the movie. Speaking of movies, I saw District 9 in the theater, and I guess that was sort of my reference for South Africa for probably a decade. What was your thought on District 9?
So funny. That's like 90% of the people I've met in the States, that's kind of the reaction you get. I loved it. Honestly, like I thought it was really, really, the humor was great. And just the storyline. I mean, it was a pretty, it was just very, very relevant, and they played on a couple sort of like sensitive political problems in South Africa
that we probably didn't pick up on.
Exactly. There's some like taboo topics in terms of like the divides in the country and the townships and just these aliens arriving, and it was really, really well put together, really smart. I think post visiting South Africa, it's worth watching again just to get some of that context.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm a huge fan.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I think with that, we'll wrap things up. Benji, again, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Hope the listeners enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Benji.